They thought they were unstoppable. A room full of powerful men plotting in secret, ready to fire the young black CEO they believed didn't belong. But what they didn't know was that the woman they tried to erase owned the very company they worked for. And when the truth came out, everything changed. Welcome to BrainFuel, a place where stories aren't just told, they inspire. Here, we share powerful tales of courage, resilience, and the fight for respect. If you believe in justice, if you believe in strength against all odds, then join our family. Hit subscribe, support the channel, and let's keep fueling minds with stories that matter. She walked into the boardroom, confident, graceful, and calm. Yet, in that room full of polished suits and cold stares, no one believed she belonged. From the very first step she took across the glossy marble floor, the whispers began. Some of the older men in gray suits exchanged quick glances, as if they were silently asking each other the same question. Who does she think she is? Her name was Amara Johnson. She was only 34 years old, yet her resume read like a blueprint of ambition. She had started from nothing, born in a small neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Amara studied under streetlights when the electricity was cut off, sold lemonade on corners to save money for her first computer, and fought through every stereotype that said she didn't belong in the business world. And now here she was, in a towering glass skyscraper, standing at the head of a company that she herself had built. But the strange thing was, very few people in that room actually knew the truth. To them, she was the new executive. Some thought she was hired as a diversity figure. Others assumed she was just a department manager. None of them could imagine that the young black woman standing before them was actually the majority shareholder, founder, and true CEO. Amara had grown used to this. For years, she had seen the double takes when she introduced herself at conferences. She had felt the sting of being ignored in meetings until a male colleague repeated her exact idea and got credit. She had sat through business dinners where investors looked past her and addressed questions only to her white male staff. It hurt. It made her angry sometimes. But most of all, it fueled her. Because every time someone doubted her, she reminded herself of one truth. She had earned her place here, more than anyone else. That morning, as she stood by the window waiting for the meeting to start, she could feel the weight of the room pressing against her. It wasn't the kind of silence that respected authority. It was the kind that challenged it. Eyes flickered up from laptops, scanning her with curiosity, suspicion, even quiet disdain. One executive leaned toward another and whispered, not as quietly as he thought, "Who is she again?" "Marketing." The other chuckled under his breath. "Probably. Let's just get through this." Amara heard every word. She didn't react. Instead, she smiled softly, straightened her blazer, and sat down at the head of the table. Her confidence wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. She had built her confidence brick by brick, through nights of failure, rejection letters, and people laughing at her ideas. She had learned long ago that the most powerful person in a room doesn't need to raise their voice. But the room couldn't see that power yet. The meeting began, and as the executives started talking over one another, Amara quietly observed. They dismissed her presence like she was a visitor instead of the reason the company existed. They spoke of profits, new projects, and upcoming deals, but none of them once asked for her opinion. Finally, one of them turned to her with a smirk. "So, Amara, what department are you heading again?" The tone wasn't curious. It was patronizing. It was the kind of tone people used when they thought they were smarter than you. Amara leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with him. For a moment, she considered revealing the truth right then and there, that she didn't just head a department. She headed all of them. That the company existed because she had fought tooth and nail to bring it to life. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she simply replied, "Let's just say I know every department pretty well." The man chuckled, as if she had made a joke. He didn't realize she was dead serious. As the meeting continued, Amara's mind drifted back to her journey. She remembered coding alone in her dorm room when she could barely afford internet. She remembered her first pitch meeting where investors had laughed in her face, telling her, "Sweetheart, maybe stick to something easier." She remembered the tears she cried when banks rejected her loan applications because they didn't believe a young black woman could handle millions in funding. And she remembered the exact moment she decided she would never beg anyone for a seat at the table again. Instead, she built her own table, and now everyone else wanted a seat at it. Still, as she sat there in that glossy boardroom, listening to men plan the future of companies she owned, she couldn't help but feel the sting of invisibility. It was as if her very presence was a question mark they wanted to erase. But Amara wasn't here to be erased. What they didn't know was that this very meeting, their arrogance, their underestimation, would become the turning point. They thought they were dealing with someone small, someone replaceable. They couldn't see the empire she had already built or the authority she carried in silence. Amara looked around the table, memorizing each face. She didn't see leaders. She saw people blinded by their own egos, people who thought power was measured by titles on a business card. She smiled again, not out of kindness this time, but out of certainty. Soon, they'll know exactly who I am. And with that thought, she leaned back in her chair, ready to let them dig their own graves, one arrogant assumption at a time. In every company, there are whispers. Whispers in hallways, whispers over coffee breaks, whispers shared in late-night text messages. But in Amara's company, those whispers had grown into something darker. A small group of executives, men who wore the same tailored suits, who golfed at the same country clubs, who spoke with the same false confidence, had convinced themselves of one dangerous lie, that they were the real power behind the company. It began innocently enough. At first, they dismissed Amara as lucky. They told themselves the company's success wasn't because of her vision, but because of their experience and expertise. Whenever her strategies worked, they quietly congratulated themselves instead. Whenever the company grew, they told each other it was their decisions that made it possible. Soon, their private conversations began to take on a new tone, one of resentment. "She's too inexperienced to lead at this level," one of them muttered over whiskey at a downtown lounge. "She doesn't understand the bigger picture," another agreed, swirling his glass as if the amber liquid held wisdom. And then came the words that would set everything in motion. If she wasn't here, the company would run smoother. That sentence became the seed of conspiracy. The plotting started small. They began excluding her from email chains, forgetting to update her on major decisions, deliberately scheduling meetings at times they knew she couldn't attend. It was their way of testing how far they could go without her interference. One afternoon, when Amara suggested a bold new project, the executive smiled politely and nodded during the meeting. But the moment she left the room, they tore it apart. "She doesn't know what she's talking about." One sneered. "Let's just quietly drop it. No need to waste resources on her experiments." Little by little, they built a narrative in their own heads. Amara wasn't a visionary. She was an obstacle. But what made their arrogance truly dangerous was ignorance. They didn't know she owned the company. They assumed she was just another appointed CEO, a figurehead brought in to look good in press releases. In their minds, the real control was in their hands. So they began to whisper bolder ideas. One rainy evening, 5 of the top executives gathered in a private room at a steakhouse. The atmosphere was thick with cigar smoke and self-importance. They sat around a polished wooden table, talking in low voices, so the waiters couldn't overhear. "Gentlemen," said Richard, the oldest and most self-assured of the group, "it's time we address the problem head-on. This company can't thrive with her at the top." The others nodded, sipping their drinks. "She's reckless," another chimed in. "Every time she talks, I feel like I'm listening to a motivational speaker, not a CEO." "Exactly," Richard said, leaning forward. "We need stability. Someone who understands a market. Someone who understands us." "And who would that be?" another asked with a sly smile. Richard's lips curled upward. "Well, I think any one of us could handle it better than she can." The table erupted with quiet laughter. To them, it wasn't a question of if they could take her down, but when. The conspiracy grew stronger over the next few weeks. They met secretly in parking lots, exchanged coded messages, and slowly drafted a plan. They would push her out under guise of poor performance and loss of confidence. "She won't see it coming," one said with satisfaction. But deep down, some of them felt uneasy. Not because they feared Amara, but because of how calm she always seemed. She never raised her voice in meetings, never begged for approval, never fought for recognition. She just sat there, watching. Maybe she knows more than she lets on, one whispered nervously during a secret meeting. Nonsense, Richard snapped. She's young. She's naive. She's in over her head. Trust me, when we confront her, she'll fold. They always do. And that was a mistake. Thinking Amara was just another person who would crumble under pressure. Meanwhile, Amara wasn't blind. She noticed the missing emails, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the way certain projects she approved mysteriously disappeared from the agenda. She wasn't surprised. She had seen this before. Men who underestimated her, who thought titles and traditions made them kings. But she didn't confront them yet. Instead, she let them play their game, weaving their own web of arrogance. Because Amara knew something they didn't. When people reveal their true intentions, you don't stop them. You let them keep talking until they trap themselves. By the time the executives finalized their plan, they were convinced of their victory. They had prepared documents, rehearsed speeches, and even chosen who would step into a role once she was removed. Next week, Richard said confidently at their final secret meeting, we call her into the boardroom. We make it official. She'll be out of here before she realizes what's happening. The others laughed and clinked their glasses together in celebration. None of them knew the truth, that the woman they were so eager to destroy had already signed their futures in ink. And as the rain pounded against the restaurant windows that night, Amara sat in her office across town, staring at the city lights. She knew betrayal was brewing. She could feel it in the air, like a storm waiting to break. But she wasn't afraid. No storm scared the person who built the house from the ground up. Amara smiled to herself, closing her laptop. Let them come, she whispered. They have no idea who they're dealing with. The morning of the meeting arrived like any other, but something in the air felt different. The sky was overcast, heavy with clouds, as though even nature knew something was about to break. Amara woke up early, as she always did. She brewed her coffee, sat by the window, and scanned her emails. She noticed the invitation again. Executive Strategy Meeting, 9 a.m., boardroom. Nothing unusual, at least on the surface, but she could feel the tension beneath it. For weeks, she had sensed the plotting. She had seen the smirks, the secret glances, the conversations that stopped when she walked into the room. Today, she knew they would finally make their move, and she was ready. At exactly 9 a.m., Amara stepped into the boardroom. The long, polished table stretched out before her, lined with men in dark suits. Some avoided her eyes. Others looked at her with smug confidence. Papers were neatly stacked, pens aligned. It felt less like a meeting and more like a courtroom, and she was the accused. "Good morning," she said warmly, pulling out her chair at the head of the table. The response was tepid. A few muttered greetings, but most remained silent. The air was thick, heavy with unspoken words. Richard, the oldest and self-proclaimed leader of the group, cleared his throat. He leaned forward, hands folded like a judge about to deliver a sentence. "Amara," he began, his voice steady but laced with arrogance. "We've been reviewing the company's direction, and frankly, we have concerns." Amara tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Concerns?" "Yes," Richard said firmly. "We feel your leadership style has become impractical, too emotional, too risky." Another executive jumped in quickly, as if rehearsed. "Your decisions, while ambitious, don't align with the stability this company needs." "And the board," added a third, "has lost confidence in your ability to lead us into the future." The words hung in the air. Amara sat completely still, her face unreadable. Around the table, the men exchanged glances, feeding off each other's bravado. Finally, Richard delivered the final blow. "After careful consideration, we believe it's in the best interest of the company that you step down." There it was, the betrayal, spoken out loud. The room grew silent, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Every eye turned toward Amara, waiting for her reaction. Some expected outrage, raised voices, maybe even tears. Others anticipated desperate pleading, the kind they had seen from people who suddenly realized their careers were over. But Amara didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, hands resting calmly on the armrests, and simply asked, "Is that so?" Her tone wasn't offensive. It wasn't shocked. It was calm, too calm. The men shifted uneasily in their seats. Richard, determined to maintain control, pressed on. "Yes, we've already begun drafting the transition plan. This will be effective immediately." He slid a folder across the table toward her, filled with paperwork. "All we need is your signature." Amara placed her hand gently on the folder, but didn't open it. Instead, she looked up, her eyes sweeping across the table, meeting each man's gaze in turn. "So let me understand," she said slowly, her voice carrying just enough weight to make the room fall silent. "You've all decided to fire me?" No one answered directly. Instead, there were nods, murmurs of agreement, men straightening their ties to avoid her gaze. Richard finally spoke again. "It's nothing personal, Amara. It's just business. You'll land on your feet, I'm sure. But this company needs stronger leadership." The arrogance in his tone was unmistakable. To him, this was already over. Amara sat in silence for a long moment. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Inside, she could almost laugh at their ignorance. These men, so sure of their power, so confident in their plan, didn't even realize they were trying to fire the very woman who owned them. But she wasn't ready to reveal her hand just yet. Instead, she let the silence stretch, making them squirm. One by one, they began to shift in their seats, fidgeting with pens, clearing their throats. Their confidence wavered under the weight of her steady gaze. Finally, she smiled, not a broad smile, but the kind of smile that hinted at a secret no one else knew. "I see," she said softly. "So this is how it is." Richard nodded quickly, relieved that she seemed to be accepting it. "Yes, I think it's for the best. The sooner we move forward, the better." Amara placed a folder back in the center of the table. She folded her hands neatly and leaned forward, her voice dropping just enough to make every ear strain to hear. "Gentlemen," she said, "you have no idea what you've just done." Confusion rippled across the table. They glanced at one another, unsure if she was bluffing. But Amara didn't explain. Not yet. She wanted the weight of those words to sink in. Instead, she stood gracefully, gathering her notes. Her movements were slow, deliberate, commanding. The silence in the room was deafening now, filled with unspoken fear. As she reached the door, she turned back one last time. Her eyes locked with Richard's, and for the first time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Doubt. "Enjoy the rest of your meeting," Amara said calmly. "I'll see you soon." And with that, she walked out, leaving a room full of powerful men staring at one another in uneasy silence. They thought they had won. They thought the story was over. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that the real story was only just beginning. The following morning, the executives gathered in the boardroom again. They came early, buzzing with excitement. For them, yesterday had been a victory. They had finally confronted Amara, pushed her toward the door, and in their minds, the company was theirs to control. Richard walked in last, carrying a leather briefcase, his chin high. "Gentlemen," he said with a smug grin, "today we begin a new chapter." The others chuckled in agreement. They spoke of future deals, restructuring, and promotions. Not one of them mentioned Amara. She was already erased from their narrative. But just as the clock struck 9, the door swung open. And there she was. Amara walked in slowly, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She wore the same calm expression she always had, but something in her eyes was different. Stronger, sharper, as though she had been waiting for this very moment. The room fell silent. Some shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Others forced polite smiles, pretending nothing had happened. Richard, trying to maintain control, cleared his throat. "Amara, we didn't expect you today." "No," she replied, her voice steady. "I imagine you didn't." She walked to the head of the table. The seat they had assumed was no longer hers, and placed a thick folder on the surface. Slowly, She sat down, her posture straight, her gaze unshakable. "Before we begin," she said, opening the folder, "I think it's time we clear up a few misunderstandings." The men exchanged puzzled looks. One of them whispered, "What is she doing?" Amara pulled out the first document and slid it across the table toward Richard. "This," she said, "is the incorporation record of this company. Notice the signature at the bottom?" Richard frowned as he scanned the page. His smirk faded. The signature was hers, Amara Johnson. "That's right," she said, watching his face change. "I founded this company." Murmurs erupted around the table. One of the executives leaned over to another, whispering frantically, "She can't be serious." But Amara was far from finished. She pulled out another document. "And this," she continued, sliding it toward them, "is the shareholder agreement. You'll notice that I hold a controlling stake, 51%, which means legally every major decision in this company requires my approval." The room went silent again. Papers rustled nervously as the men skimmed the page, their confidence draining with every line. Amara's voice grew firmer. "And finally, here's the most important one, the employment contracts. Do you see the signature here?" She tapped the page. "Every one of you works for me." The revelation hit like a thunderclap. The executives stared at her, pale-faced, their arrogance collapsing into shock. Richard tried to speak, but his voice faltered. This must be a mistake. Amara leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "No mistake. The only mistake was believing you could fire me. You see, gentlemen, you don't own this company. I do." A heavy silence filled the room. The men who had plotted her downfall sat frozen, their carefully built illusion of power shattered in an instant. Amara let the silence linger. She wanted them to feel it, the weight of their ignorance, the reality of their betrayal. Then, calmly, she continued, "You thought I was a figurehead, a placeholder, someone you could manipulate. But while you were busy whispering in corners and congratulating yourselves, I was building an empire. And today, you finally learned the truth." One executive, younger than the rest, tried to recover. "Amara, wait, maybe we misunderstood. Maybe this was just a miscommunication." She raised an eyebrow. "A miscommunication? You conspired to remove me. You drafted papers, rehearsed speeches, celebrated behind closed doors. That isn't miscommunication. That's betrayal." His face flushed red. He lowered his head, unable to respond. Richard, still clinging to control, slammed his hand on the table. "You can't just walk in here and threaten us. We've given years to this company. Without us, you're nothing." Amara's expression didn't change. She simply opened another folder and pulled out a final document. "Actually, Richard, without me, you're nothing, because as of this moment, I'm terminating your contracts." She slid a stack of termination letters across the table. Each one bore her signature. Gasps filled the room. Some executives immediately began protesting. "You can't do this. This is outrageous. We'll fight you in court." Amara stood, her voice cutting through chaos. "You're welcome to try. But remember, these signatures, these records, this company, it all leads back to me. So go ahead. Call your lawyers. Call the press. At the end of the day, I'll still be standing here. And you'll be out there explaining to the world why you tried to overthrow the woman who owns everything you once claimed as yours." The room fell silent once more. The arrogance that had filled it only yesterday was gone, replaced by fear and disbelief. One by one, the executives lowered their eyes. Their kingdom of whispers had crumbled, and the woman they thought was powerless now stood taller than ever. Amara gathered her papers, her movements calm and deliberate. She looked around the table one last time, her gaze steady, her voice resolute. "You tried to erase me. You tried to take what I built. But remember this. Power doesn't come from titles or whispers or secret meetings. Power comes from ownership. And ownership is something you'll never take from me." With that, she closed her folder, tucked it under her arm, and turned toward the door. As she walked out, the executives sat frozen, their world shattered. For the first time, they realized the truth. The woman they had underestimated was not just their CEO. She was their boss, their founder, their owner, and she had just fired them all. The story of what happened in that boardroom spread like wildfire. It didn't just trickle out, it exploded. Within hours, the whispers of betrayal and revelation became the loudest conversation in the entire company. Employees in every department, engineers, marketers, assistants, janitors, were buzzing with shock. They had seen the executives strutting through the halls like kings, always speaking with authority, always looking down on others. And now, those same men were packing their things into cardboard boxes, their faces pale, their arrogance gone. Some employees cheered quietly. Others watched in stunned silence. But all of them felt the same truth settle deep inside them. They had just witnessed something historic. When Amara walked back through the office that afternoon, the atmosphere shifted. Heads turned, eyes widened. Some stood, others whispered her name. But for the first time, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel doubted. She felt seen. And in turn, no older than 20, stopped her in the hallway. His voice trembled as he said, "Ms. Johnson, I just want to say thank you. You don't know what this means to people like me." Amara smiled softly. "Never let anyone tell you where you don't belong," she said. "If there's no seat at the table, build your own table." The young man nodded, his eyes shining with inspiration. That night, when the story hit the news, it wasn't just about corporate drama. Headlines blared across financial networks. Executives try to fire Black CEO, discover she owns a company. The CEO who fired her own board. Amara Johnson, the woman who turned betrayal into triumph. The public was fascinated. Some praised her brilliance. Others called it poetic justice. But for those who had ever been underestimated, ignored, or dismissed, Amara became a symbol of hope. Meanwhile, the former executives faced humiliation. Once powerful voices in the industry, they were now remembered only for their arrogance. Their resumes might list achievements, but their reputations carried a scar they could never erase. They had been outplayed, outsmarted, and outclassed by the very woman they tried to erase. Amara didn't gloat. She didn't call for revenge. Instead, she focused on rebuilding the company's culture. She gathered her employees together, speaking not as a boss behind a podium, but as a leader standing among them. "This company," she said, her voice strong yet warm, "was never built on fear or politics. It was built on vision, innovation, and resilience. From this day forward, let us remember, no one succeeds alone. No one thrives by tearing others down. We rise together, or we don't rise at all." Her words resonated. People clapped. Some even cried. For the first time, the company felt united, not under fear of arrogant leaders, but under the inspiration of someone who had lived the very struggle they all faced. Outside the company walls, the lesson echoed even louder. Universities invited her to speak. Young entrepreneurs studied her story. Communities that had long been overlooked pointed to Amara as living proof that resilience could break barriers. She didn't just represent success. She represented possibility. And for Amara, that was the greatest victory. Not firing her betrayers, not proving herself right, but showing the world that true power comes not from titles, but from ownership, vision, and courage. One evening, weeks after the dramatic boardroom showdown, Amara sat alone in her office, looking out over the city skyline. The glow of the buildings reflected in the glass. Each light a reminder of the people who worked, dreamed, and fought for their futures. She thought back to her childhood. The dimly lit apartment, the long nights under street lamps with her books, the times she almost gave up. She thought of her mother, who once told her, "Baby, don't let them tell you who you are. Show them." And now she had. A knock came at the door. It was the same intern who had spoken to her that day. He held a small notebook in his hand. "Ms. Johnson," he said nervously, "I want to start my own business one day. Do you think I can?" Amara looked at him, seeing a reflection of herself years ago, hungry, uncertain, but full of potential. She smiled. "You don't need permission," she told him. "You just need persistence. And when they underestimate you, which they will, let that be your fuel, not your weakness. Remember, They can doubt you, but they can't define you. The intern nodded, his eyes lighting up, and that was the true legacy of that day. Not the firing, not the shock, not even the headlines. The real legacy was a lesson that echoed in every heart that heard her story. That no matter your color, your gender, your age, or your background, you're not defined by how others see you. You are defined by the fire inside you, by your refusal to give up, and by the courage to own your destiny. For Mara Johnson, it wasn't just about proving her power. It was about paving the way for others to discover their own. And as she looked out at the city that night, one thought burned brighter than all the lights below. They tried to erase me. Instead, I became unforgettable.